G'day friends and fans, welcome to Day Talk Stuff Ukraine War Update for the 7th of August 2026. I'm your host today, Author David Applegate, author of the books The Boy Undeclared, Power Games, Into the Earthbound and The Erotic Tales from the Empire. All my links are in the link tree. Now, the reason why I say we are now in a undeclared war, global war that is the Ukraine war, the Ukraine conflict, the Ukraine military crisis is becoming global. Sweden seized a Russian tanker and gave it to Ukraine. Tensions in the Malacca Strait. Ukraine striking ships globally, allegedly backed by other nations' navies. Geopolitical tensions rising, though Ukraine did strike a Ukrainian freighter and subsequently apologized on the threat of a Iranian missile attack. The escalations continue. I'll get to the asymmetric war, the global asymmetric war soon. First, Russia's attacked Western Ukraine, which it rarely does, but it is becoming increasingly the industrial heartland of Ukraine. And so to cause the most outages, the most, shall we say, in the gears, put the most spanners in the gears, they're targeting power. And of course, they would also be targeting those factories that when the power goes out, stay on. So, also attacks on Kiev, which are almost becoming constant. Kharkiv today was spared, but not the those Russian strikes here at Bulgaria, Pavlograd, north of Zaporozhye, a convoy was attacked. Kherson was shelled. Odessa and other ports were attacked. And that's an old marker. Of course, Sumy was hit a couple of times as well. Now, the Russians have broken out and expanded the northern buffer zone. They've taken quite a chunk of land, and they've opened up attacks in other fronts. They continue here. The breakout here continues towards Belikodets. The breakout here, the Russians have broken Ukrainian lines, and they have renewed attacks in Kupiansk with some success. Not much, though, only moderate, light. The breakout here is possibly just misinformation or earlier reports, either fabricated or exaggerated, but the Russians didn't take much land here. And during the day, you could get reports, but advances 6 hours later can be pushed back. This is just as it stands now. Small success here outside of Lyman, or the main part of Lyman, heading towards Stransky, hitting the Ukrainians from behind, who have to come through Lyman and under Russian fire to get there. Increasingly, those deliveries are by drones. Some of them are air parcel drones. All right, so here we have lots of fighting here, but fighting is concentrated here with the push. These are sometimes reported that these are Sometimes when they report shelling, they report the origin, not the destination, which is weird. But that's how it operates. We don't always get accurate news. We get where the shelling came from sometimes, and of course that's because they are shelling no-name positions, or the Ukrainians don't want you to know how far the Russians or how well the Russians are doing. But the Russians have taken more land here at Mivlogovia. Nothing here yet. Still fighting over this bridge, though the Russians have made ground. The Russians have taken a little bit of territory here, but in the centre, on the Koshnikovia side, but not much. They are slowly swallowing Novivka. They've, while holding the line here at Dranivka, they continue to deal with Ukrainian infiltrators. However, this area here is contested, and though under fire control, it is heavily infiltrated by both sides. Again, Ukrainian infiltrators are trying to break through Russian lines to get them to retreat, but Russia is pushing the advance and the advantage towards Novohovkivka, and they're still though they have failed to make headway in Shnovka, Torsk. They're on the northern outskirts. Yeah, they're pushing back here as well. So this is just a crossing while they're trying to control. They do control both sides of the river, but the Ukrainians are still on the northern side, still pushing on this road. So the Russians, though controlling most of Tordishki, have been pushed back, not much, a little bit. Now, airstrip. Now, whenever you see a town divided by a big, long, straight road, that's an airstrip. Now, the Russians have taken a little bit, but not much land. Vilna is like, what do we say, 1/8. All of this is, of course, still push, but no results. But as you can see, parts of they are on the outskirts of Dopanylia, and about 1/8 of Hanvenka. Here again, about 1/8 of Vininsky. Still, they've taken a little bit of Sneverovka. Is it Sneverovka or Stevanovka? Stevanovka. Pushing on the outskirts of Malavishki. The Ukrainians have a lot of pressure on them, as the Russian, and we're not even halfway around the map, and you can see the Russians are pushing, though they are not making ground elsewhere. They are attacking asymmetrically across the battlefield where they can. This breakout has failed to continue. This one has been idle for some time. But as you can see, there's a lot of little, as you can see, whoops. There's a lot of little towns here on the edge where they are, where they are, what you would say, stuck. But the idea is, and it's the same here, they control both sides of the river. They are going to push out, pushing towards here. And it could be a race to see who cuts off Orkiv, which folds all of this. This crumbles, take across here. This starts to crumble. Though crumbling may take some time, and they are pushing from different directions. Now, Kherson, on the other hand, and other areas are quiet. Now, we'll get to the Moscow bombing shortly. We have found out more information on that. And there are some Ukrainian channels who are cheering the murder of a Russian general. He wasn't killed on the battlefield, but you may claim he's a legitimate military target. Well, does that make you a military target? When do you decide that killing one Russian general is worth killing 5 civilians? Oh, wait. You cheered those too. Many channels out there right now covering the war are cheering murder of civilians. And then they'll tell you that, and they will tell you to your face what they think about Russians, because YouTube will not ban them for their racism, because it's trending. Just like wokeism was trending. So Russophobia and wokeism are very entwined. And I thought you learnt the dangers of blaming others. Because if you continue to blame others, you will end up with the mustache man, or a clone of the mustache man, politically and mentally. Geopolitics follows patterns of human behavior. Now, before we get into that topic, the Empire Bells, they're not suitable for work art book. Volume 1, The Empress Sora. I would have hoped that I would have got some more followers by now, but what we have is tomorrow, knock wood, tomorrow night I will launch live the Kickstarter. All right, I'm probably honoured. And that will probably be a special video update on its own. Here we go. The senior Russian officer was amongst the 5 murdered in a Moscow explosion. It's known as some call it the Balzi incident. Some reports call it the Rossi incident. We are going with most searches for the Balzi incident will get you shall we say, more neutral reporting. If you look for the Rossi incident, you'll get lots of pro-Ukrainian cheering and jeering and smearing. Whether or not you believe Ukraine is in the right or wrong does not dismiss the Moscow attack as terror tactics. The intended goal is to terrorize the Russian people into ending the war in Ukraine in Zelensky's favor. That has backfired. Many international bodies and independent observers have widely documented systematic missile and drone campaigns by both Russia and Ukraine. Russia has undoubtedly attacked civilian infrastructure, and you can call that state-sponsored terrorism. Yet, when Ukraine attacks civilian ports, civilian shipping, civilian power stations, the majority of the mainstream media, the majority of the majority of war channels are pro-Ukrainian and report them as attacks on military targets. The Russian president and Kremlin officials routinely accuse Ukrainians of terrorism, and most of those never reach the West, though they do report detail these daily in the UN and other international bodies, mostly to deafening silence, often getting no response other than the Europeans immediately walking out when the Russian ambassador or the Russian special envoy enter the room. The Ukrainian representative of the UN has been routinely filmed mocking the deaths of Russians. This has consequences, which you may call me pro-Russian, you may call me what you want, but I am reporting how it's unfolding, not how you want it to happen. I'm not giving you the ball-tickling treatment telling you what you want to happen, what you think is happening. I am telling you what is happening. Ukrainian attacks on Russia are always preceded by Russian attacks on Ukraine. And then after every Ukrainian attack, Russia goes on the news, accuses Ukraine of terrorism, and announces a defensive attack on Ukrainian military and logistics and fires on Ukraine. Now, sometimes they engage in asymmetric retaliation. And yes, a lot of that asymmetric retaliation is terrorism. We'll get to some of the asymmetric attacks Russia has conducted, the majority of which never make it to mainstream reporting. I told you about one yesterday where the Russians are replacing the impact detonator. So they're making an anti-tank mine, either an anti-personnel mine and taping down a smaller detonator, right? Because a larger detonator pressure plate requires a heavy vehicle. But if they lower the plate, a 1 ton or 1 ton to 2 ton personnel carrier rolling over an anti-tank mine, that is decimating to the vehicle. It incinerates it in the initial explosion. It literally, figuratively, however you want to put it, tears men asunder. You are not walking away from that. You have a 3 to 5 second painful death as you are both incinerated, suffocated, crushed, and what do you call it? Is it eviscerated? Yeah. So it is probably one of the most horrific yet quick deaths. And so can you say dropping an anti-tank mine into a Ukrainian trench? Yeah. That's direct action. That is way more explosive than hitting it with an artillery shell. And these attacks are not only encouraged by the Russian state, they are shipping any and all mines they can to the front to continue these attacks because they are having an effect. The Ukrainian attacks have consolidated Putin's domestic support. Support for Putin is up. China believes that Russia is justified in its escalation of its attacks. And even with the small few military setbacks that Russia has had, such as losing ground in, such as the failure to take Kherson, the failure recently in, what's the name? I have to look at the map. I'm sorry. Here we go. 2 of the biggest setbacks. Failure to take Zelensky. Failure here. This is one of the biggest failures. Same here. Russia was all the way up through here. Remember how they surrounded this town and failed to take it? They failed to clear Koshnikovia. They failed to secure the outskirts of Kyiv with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm trying to remember. About 20 to 30 trench networks all the way through here. They failed to break the logistics hub of Ukraine. They failed to completely disrupt communications in Ukraine. They're a year behind their plans, at least according to some 2 years. It could be as high as 2 years. Don't forget, military plans are a little bit more flexible than, say, your average corporate plan. But they're just as ruthless, right? You think, if you've ever been in the corporate world, the military is just as ruthless. Well, I'm not talking about the US military. I'm talking about the Russian military infrastructure is very corporatized, very ruthless. Now, Ukraine has, Putin is now able to justify internationally to international observers his escalation. Protests in the UN about Sweden seizing Russian ships and handing them to Ukraine have gone on deaf ears. Will Russia declare war against Sweden? That is very unlikely. So what we have now is Putin able to justify to even some skeptics the military actions. Though deep strike vulnerabilities have been exposed, it also exposes every other country to the same deep strikes. And Putin has been able to conduct deep strikes using Ukraine's own tactics. Now, they have sent warning messages, as you saw with leaving a drone at a German airport, a Russian drone at a German airport, that they could do the same. If they're going to sneak up, if Ukraine could sneak into Moscow, get to the edge of the Russian airport and set up to hit a passenger jet, though the Ukrainian was killed by a sniper, where the Russian who snuck in put the drone there at the airport to say, we know you're behind this. And I am telling you, these are tactics you may not understand, right? Russia is saying, by planting that drone at the German airport, they are saying, we know you helped the Ukrainians conduct attempt an attack on a Russian passenger jet. They were telling you to back off, Germany, to get your agents under control. Now, sometimes the actions of field agents, we never know whether or not that field agent was justified, ordered, or given the, if you get weakened or not, you can do it, but if you get caught, you're dead. If you get exposed, you're denied. I am just telling you how it is on both sides. You cannot analyze Russia from an American perspective. You have to analyze Russia from a Russian perspective. You have to analyze Ukraine from a Ukrainian perspective. Now, suppressing dissent. Russia has been able to rally the flag. Now, what this is now civilians can now justify the strict domestic security measures. Civilians are now more likely to dob in dissenters as pro-Ukrainian. Civil liberties, warrants, no. This is now an internal wartime security operation where if you see something, say something. This is pretty much the same after 9/11. Where people were flooding the tip lines with all the Al Jazeera watching nose pickers who always side with America's enemies. Nothing was done, of course, but in Russia, that's a different story. When you go on a list in Russia, you never get off that list. They never forget. And they never forget political commentators across the world who say nasty things about Russia. They do get you in the end if you try to go to Russia, it makes it easier for them. Russia conducts asymmetric warfare. That is why Europe is so pissed off. But you had an opportunity to put an end to this childish behaviour. Instead, you reinforced it. And if you don't think Mandami is China's way of sticking it to you, then you really don't understand asymmetric warfare, and I failed to teach you anything. Shaping international narrative. Because Ukraine can conduct asymmetric counterstrikes with terrorism, Moscow justifies it to Africa, to South America, and to its allies in Asia and across the broader, the global South, that you cannot rely on Western support. And if you cross the West, right, they will engage in illegitimate terrorist regime change. So a lot of countries are no longer moving towards a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy around the world is becoming a slur. Undermining Western support. The Kremlin has been able to mobilize war fatigue. That Ukraine is an illegitimate terrorist regime, fueled by the fact that Zelensky has stayed in office past his term using national security laws, and which were designed for 90 days or less, after which power is supposed to transfer to the parliament, and he steps down, which he won't. And he is running, and most of his appointees are members of the Ukrainian security apparatus, which again fuels the whole narrative that the Ukraine is run by the deep state. Now, senior Russian officer was amongst 5 dead. It's known as the Balzi Rossi restaurant attack. And, civilians, staff at the restaurant. Now, the August bombing 2 days ago heavily illustrates what I'm talking about. This is an incident that blurs the line between targeted military operations and acts of terrorism. They're not targeting him on the battlefield like the Germans did in World War I. Germany in World War I didn't fly to London and conduct assassinations. They kept it to the battlefield. Yet the Germans were vilified. Now, there's an ethical and legal controversy surrounding these high-profile assassinations behind enemy lines. International law does not clarify what types of actions are legal, and many legal analysis define Ukraine's actions as terrorism. Now, why is this declared terrorism? 1, they targeted a civilian location. Bystanders, the chance of bystanders was 100%. There were over 20 injuries, which included a private security guard, a restaurant customer, and restaurant staff. International law that says attacks that cause predictable, disproportionate civilian casualties violate the rules of war. Obama has violated, of course, the rules of law numerous times with the drone strikes. Remember how he called the Bush drone strikes an act of terrorism. Yet he conducted more strikes than anyone else. and that monster is still around free. Not because he's the monster, not because he killed terrorists, but because he killed disproportionately way more civilians than any terrorist. Use of deceptive and blind assets. Russian media outlets have reported the female courier has no known awareness that she was carrying a bomb. There's no message. There's no deposit of funds. She was, as far as she knows, delivering a birthday gift. Instead, it was a lethal device with metal balls, which many critics highlight as an act of terrorism. Highly public place in a capital city, inside a civilian population, it fits the operational definition of terrorism. Asymmetric warfare in the military argument. Ukraine has not officially claimed responsibility. All they said was that the intended target was Colonel General Alexander Cheko, Commander-in-Chief of Russian Aerospace Forces, and Lieutenant General Igor Yuzhimov, because these figures oversee the direct aerial campaign and missile strikes against Ukraine. According to Ukraine, military doctrine declares them high-value military targets. Well, target them in the headquarters. Target them on the battlefield. But because cowards strike the soft underbelly of civilization, cowards will strike the soft underbelly of civilization. Whether you're Russian or Ukrainian, you should never engage in high-value target justification. Now, we've heard many times, and Hollywood has blurred the lines many times with their glorification of war with movies like Sayonara, spelt serious, not spelt the proper way though. Again, George Clooney being, I'm so clever, but not really. All he did was compile a bunch of international incidences and run it through ChatGPT. But it is not wrong that both sides in international conflicts blur the line between military target and public terror. And you've got to remember, and I think probably people haven't, that none of the names I mentioned, was the birthdays, yes, Belarusi restaurant, that the last time I checked was not a military target. Now, another reason why Ukraine's paints this as legitimate, that the Kiev Independent claims that this is a legitimate military target, is moral equivalence. By claiming that Russia engages in asymmetric warfare, Ukraine is justified in counterstrikes. However, have I not pointed out time after time, Ukrainian strike 16, 18 to 20 hours ago is followed 3 to 4 hours later by a Russian attack. Last time I checked, if you attack first, you're the aggressor. If Russia fires 3 hours after the Ukrainian attack, that makes them the defender. But the international community has been noted as softening its stance on Russia's extensive war crimes, because this is the specific argument. Anybody know the Pacific argument? Right. 1946 to 1948, series of war crime tribunals. And Nuremberg was the main trial, but there were many war crime tribunals. Russia, America, Germany, and Britain, they all held their own inquiries into various bombings, oversaw and interviewed thousands of witnesses. And one of the Japanese admirals defended himself. He was asked why they did not rescue the survivors of a U.S. warship they sank off the coast of Japan. It was the last U.S. warship officially to sink, and they did not report it for decades. Most of the crew survived and were with a huge traumatic experience where they watched some of their shipmates eaten by sharks. They even saw Japanese planes fly overhead. They were terrified young men, no longer a threat to the security of Japan. They had even offered surrender to Japan, allegedly, but that has been debunked, allegedly. No, nothing about the sinking of a US warship off the Japanese coast rarely comes up. But it's the justification of a Japanese general for getting off war crimes, because he had sunk numerous civilian shipping throughout World War II with his submarines. He had left, his ships had routinely left sailors to drown or starve in open sea, away from port, drifting without radio or flares or food. But I forget which American admiral it was, had engaged in total warfare when they sunk Japanese ships off the coast of the Philippines. They never picked up one survivor. Moral equivalence is a legitimate legal defense. Russia can morally equivalence its way out of every war crime. You can look it up, you can debate me, whatever. You could call me pro-Russian. I am just telling you what Russia is claiming. And that they can claim moral equivalence because every attack they have conducted has always been after a similar Ukrainian attack. And that Ukraine has attacked Russia more times than I'm talking about outside the official declared military zone, right? Such as Ukraine's invasion of Kursk, outside of the declared military zone, without an act of parliament or a declaration of war. Undermining Western support. The Kremlin has been able to get moderate Democrats to go along with anti-Ukrainian sentiment. Now, anti-Ukrainian sentiment is growing in the West. It is primarily driven by war fatigue. People who can't meet their healthcare bills are very upset. Of course, they blame Republicans, but Democrats are the ones who claim Trump is in Putin's bag and forcing Trump to continue, trying to force Trump to continue to fund the Ukraine war. Democrats on the fanatical side are supporting Ukraine, one of America's formerly declared enemies that was supposed to take care of under the Budapest Memorandum. The memorandum and international law says nothing about supporting you from civil war, right, or a military operation in disputed territories. The integrity of Ukraine was to prevent, and again, when China abandoned Ukraine and Ukraine turned to the West in their dispute against Russia. And it was the West that encouraged war. And for 10 years, Putin watched, almost 10 years, well, closer to 9.2 years, I should say, watched as Ukrainian civilians were armed, went out in militias such as the Azov Battalion and murdered ethnic Russians or people they suspected of supporting Russia or just to kill someone for their land. It was, and the Donbass were losing and they sued for peace. And under the Minsk Accords, what happened? The militias didn't stop fighting, did they? And Ukraine blamed Russia. Minsk Accords too. So again, broken by militias and blame put on Russia. So the Russian military went in and haven't stopped since. If Ukraine, in that 6-month delay, had held an election or planned an election, no, Russia caught Merkel, Hollande, and I forget the name, Zelensky's aide, and Zelensky, all in a group chat on Telegram, planning a war with Russia, allegedly. They have yet to produce the evidence. But there is an interview where you can look it up, Hollande, admitting they planned to only use the Minsk Accords to rearm Ukraine. Which, again, plays right into Russia's hands. The left want to destabilise the West and gaslight you every step of the way so that you will not make your own decisions but follow whatever narrative they push at the time. Now, a Russian officer, had he been the sole victim, legal analysts would not have termed this terrorism, but because civilians were caught up in this, more civilians than military, the use of blind assets and deception, that the woman was unlikely aware she was carrying a bomb, and devalues or completely dismisses the argument of asymmetric warfare or legitimate target. A plot. The Bucha argument. This is a claim that Russian forces during 2022 offensive, that they occupied Bucha and systematically targeted individuals who were singled out as pro-Ukrainian. And that these individuals allegedly were rounded up and shot. Now, if this was a Russian tactic, there'd be more of them. We would hear more of them. We'd hear from Ukraine. We would see international activists digging up these graves, showing them all. They'd be all over the news like they did with Rwanda. They have not Ukraine has not produced a shred of evidence, yet the mainstream media presents the Bucha attack as a proof of Russian war crimes. Now, we can't produce evidence of war crimes in Bakhmut because that is under Russian control. Bucha is now under Russian control. But back then, they had an opportunity, Ukraine had the opportunity in 2022 to produce evidence of a war crime and document it and show it to the ICC and other bodies. Russia can't get... Now, I just remembered something, and I should have clarified this sooner. Russia can't bring charges against Ukraine. If you're going to claim your crimes are merely moral equivalence, then you have to dismiss it's the other side as well. It nullifies both sides. The guilty, or basically, it's mutual guilt. Yes, Your Honour, I'm guilty, but so is my opposition. Icto facto nullification. You cannot charge the guilty with a crime the prosecutor is guilty of. I'm surprised Trump hasn't tried this. But then again, maybe Trump is innocent. Then again, also, I do think the mutual moral equivalence only applies to international law and international criminal law to but the Western hypocrisy narrative and asymmetric warfare is creating a lot of, shall we say, traction amongst the Eurosceptics, that Europe is heading down a dark path, that liberals do not have a moral standard. Now, the seizure of the Kafka. Sweden has set a precedent. Yesterday, Sweden, in a Supreme Court decision, handed over a seized Russian cargo ship, the Kafka, to Ukraine. This ship was intercepted for allegedly bypassing sanctions and allegedly transporting stolen grain. The only defence, you could go argue if you want, Sweden prejudged and even said they would only listen to the Ukrainian arguments. No matter what Russia said, they believed the ship was sanction busting and that the trial, it was nothing but a show trial, according to many commentators in Sweden who covered the trial. Now, the majority who covered the trial were pro-Ukrainian and cheered the decision. This, of course, is known as the escalation factor. You have set a precedent. You now seize ships. You now have independent countries seizing ships on your behalf and giving them to you. That is an escalation. This is sovereign assets handed to a combatant state by a third party. That's a landmark legal decision that shatters maritime boundaries of neutrality. Now remember, there has been nothing like this since the age of sail. Over 400 years ago, England, Spain, and France, later America, and I'm not sure one or the other, but 12 countries engaged in sail warfare. I think the Dutch East Indies and a few others were involved. I think China was involved briefly in the Opium Wars. But generally, the three major powers, France, Germany, of course, and Italy, but predominantly the sail nations of France, Spain, and England were using pirates to seize ships and would later collect them as prize, like Sir Francis Drake, who then later fell out of favour with the crown because of what came out about what happened to some of the female passengers, and he crossed the line by believing that being knighted legitimised his crimes and made him a member of high society. You forget your place, sir! Now, the threat of cyber escalation. Now, the escalation factor, the chances of Sweden, again, being attacked by Russia directly are almost nil. The article, that's why they joined, that's why, right, they stopped being neutral and joined the EU, so they could be a little girl hiding behind a big man and saying, yeah, 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 yeah. Now, the threat of cyber retaliation is real, and within hours of the court's decision, though Sweden is militarily off limits, apparently non-state hacktivists deployed several cyber attacks against various Baltic maritime logistics centres, including the European port infrastructure and some of the Scandinavian public grids. In other words, they disrupted the internet, traffic lights, port cranes, and caused millions in untold damages in redirecting parcels and sending stuff back to marking stuff as return. So stuff, if you're in Sweden and your Timu hasn't arrived, got bad news for you. Someone in Outer Mongolia just got that $5 sweater. So, shifting geopolitical politics, BRICS, and Chinese sanctions. China has utilised its trade networks to begin its own counter-sanctions, with the core objective to destabilise the global financial system in its favour, particularly to attack the Taiwanese economy indirectly. Iran, deepening structural ties with Russia through drone deliveries. Yeah, Russia at war is yet able to produce enough drones to supply Iran with the help of China and Pakistan and even India. Now, again, this is going beyond the covert towards overt aid by BRICS nations as a bloc to further insulate themselves from sanctions. India is engaging in pragmatic multi-alignment. They purchase discounted Russian oil while expanding its defence and technological partnerships with both Russia and the West to counter China on its borders. Now, why China is gambling on Belt and Road? They have spent trillions. Again, they have spent more than the GDP of Russia in the last 12 months on railway. Let that sink in. China has built more railway than Gavin Newsom. And that is just in Mongolia, Azerbaijan, Pakistan. Extending that rail, they are trying to extend that rail network and pipelines into Iran. Well, they attack your shipping, causing you to have your prices go up and theirs stay down, thus countering Chinese inflation. All war is economic. Now, Russia had its own network. Russia was offered a very low ball bid of around 200 billion on 1.6 trillion worth of its rail network. Now, are you surprised that Ukraine is attacking that rail network now? Or do you think that someone in Ukraine in the target selection is engaging in a multi-alignment pragmatic approach? The same with buying ammunition from India. The current outlook, war is no longer contained within, the Ukraine war is no longer contained within geopolitical boundaries. The conflict has spilled into international shipping lanes, cyberspace, and global economic institutions. It is now a broader war where there is more money being spent on cyber warfare than electronic warfare on the battlefield. We are now in an undeclared Third World War. And is it today? Did it start today or in September 2022? The concept of the undeclared war is happening today and has been happening since 2022. The friction points can be all traced to an incident in September 2022. And what is that incident? Well, actually, why September 22 is the starting point. It's when structural boundaries by Ukraine collapsed. When Ukraine and its partners destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline, but some claim, yes, Russia mobilized and annexed occupied territories. Now, the third part, of course, is where civilians were involved in warfare and Ukraine did not round up the civilian militia and prevent civilians from conducting their own street justice against those they suspected of being Russians or helping Russians. And it still goes on today, where people who aren't Ukrainian enough end up dead, and why millions have fled Ukraine. Now, the reality today, flashpoints are connected. Conflicts in the Middle East are no longer separated. According to Daily News Egypt, one small conflict in Africa, though undeclared, is a proxy war. Sorry, Middle East, where you have a network of agents of BRICS, Iran. You have the proxy networks of the West versus the Western Alliance versus BRICS, with Iran basically, though surrounded and opposed by many countries, not just, say, Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, but at least there you have a clear, defined opposing military bloc. However, according to the British, it is not as clear-cut. And yes, you would say Oman, like India, is taking the pragmatic approach. But September 2022 is more the point of no return, where the Ukraine escalated the war with the destruction of the Nord Stream, Russia's economic isolation, and BRICS turning around and creating a multipolar world to insulate themselves against the... Now, in retaliation for the Nord Stream pipeline, Russia bought Iranian drones and conducted their own strikes on gas and oil in Ukraine. The operation today, you have a fused front line where the Middle Eastern conflict and Ukraine are intrinsically linked through asymmetric warfare. Right? The war is fueled on both sides, in part, by the oil trade. Destabilizing the oil trade, wherever it is, forces prices up, benefiting Russia, hurting Ukraine. Both Russia and Ukraine have shared supply chains where Chinese dual-use technology, Iranian drones, North Korean artillery sustain Russia. Western manufacturing in India and dual-use technology from China is going to both sides, where increasingly Western manufacturing attempts to isolate Russia ends up isolating Ukraine as well. Because China responds to every sanction notice by stopping deliveries to Ukraine. Now, right now, Russia is trying to get maritime protection, I believe, for international shipping. US sanctions prevent, and English sanctions prevent that from happening. Ukraine of course, has extended its front line, and that's another escalation. The old international order is dead. Chinese financial systems are preparing to expand in a fractured global economy. So we have a breakdown of maritime law, thanks to Sweden. We have a breakdown of financial institutions, thanks to international sanctions. And in response to coming sanctions, China is engaged in now what it's called the financial insulation strategy. This is a program called CHIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment, where invoices are settled between Russia, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Beijing in a closed loop. These banks are not on SWIFT and never will be returning to SWIFT. That's 20% of the global economy. Now, you may not think that's significant, but the US is only 30% of the global economy. So it's worth the GDP, the SHIPS system is worth the GDP of India, which is pretty much third place. Think that's not insignificant? CHIPS is worth more than California. Now, digital currency, to participate in CHIPS, means you've got to engage through Chinese banks in Hong Kong with the digital yuan. Now, this is it's officially ECNY. That's E for electronic, CN for China, and Y for the symbol of yuan. Now, yuan and yen, I know look similar, but it is definitely the Chinese digital currency, and it's a stable coin backed by gold, not anything, not oil or debt. Which brings us to gold. China is the largest purchaser of gold and has been multiple times accused of engaging in resource theft while pointing its fingers at Europe and America, claiming they stole from the global south and they're the ones stealing. Yet, you can look it up. Garnier recently did kick out a European, French, English mining company and replace it with a Chinese subcontractor. 6 months later, that Chinese contractor was also fired. Garnier has taken over its own gold for the first time in history. Why? Because China stole millions of dollars. The Chinese mine engineers, they didn't pay for the gold. They loaded it and left with all the gold they mined before Garnier could catch on what happened. And the Chinese they left behind, well, let's just say they're not walking home anytime soon. Although probably interrogated, tortured, and beaten, they were probably not killed, as there have been as they were allegedly put on, as they are allegedly going to be put on trial. The mine owners have not paid their bail, but they have forked over the mine to Garnier courts. But this is one of dozens of cases across Africa of widespread theft of gold. There was also a Malaysian incident, allegedly. Now we get to asymmetric warfare by China. What's at threat? The Malacca Strait, Singapore, because China needs to secure its claim on the South China Sea and its southern flanks. Singapore would be, like the British, a massive war harbour, with most of the civilians chased out within days or weeks of taking over. It's not just... So, the two biggest checkpoints in the world, Malacca and Gibraltar, not the Red Sea. The Red Sea and the Persian Gulf? No. The next flashpoints, Malacca and Gibraltar, with Morocco and Spain trying to force out the British in Gibraltar, and in Singapore, the Chinese, Indonesians, and Indians fighting over control of the Malacca Strait through asymmetric warfare, damaging each other's ships, water canning each other's crews. This is going on now. Beijing has also been aggressive to Filipino ships, militarizing artificial islands, using migration as a strategic dynamic where Chinese are being pushed into flashpoint countries. They tried this with Taiwan, they tried this with Japan, they tried this with Korea. They've got some influence now in Korea, but they have some influence. They've always had some influence in Japan, but their influence has gone down in Japan, their influence has gone down in Taiwan, and their influence is rising in Singapore. But as recently, I forget one of the speeches, a Singaporean Chinese says, you have to oppose the CCP because there is no Singapore without private property. Let that sink in. New York. Now, global governance. While the liberal world order, backed by the Union Party, backed by the Bushes, the Cheneys, the Clintons, the Obamas, push Ursula von der Leyen, the British Labour Party, the British Tory Party, France, German left, Italians, while they push for global governance, the reality is BRICS wants a multipolar world, splitting the world roughly into 3 or even 2 factions, where you have BRICS and the Western Alliance, and then the Global South. Of course, that would be, the Global South would be led by a pragmatic India, who has its foot in where it has its footprint in the West and in BRICS and in the Global South. So India would become the de facto second tier leader, China would become the first tier leader, and the Western Alliance would be the third tier leader. And they claimed this would be achieved through the international development of Africa to offset Europe and the West. And BRICS would establish South America through Brazil as its partners in this to push back against Europe and America. Now, the pushback of the Russians claim they are pushing back against the Western-led global dominance, and that China is building an alternative trade system, in which they are. They are building the world's largest network, 50,000 kilometres of rail. That is more rail than anyone else in the world. Now, it is not exactly going well for them. China's operation, scam, spies, and the Omesh clashes. Thailand noticed growing scam centres on their borders. These scam centres led to military clashes that displaced over 650,000. These scam hubs were frontiers for Chinese intelligence, such as the and Chinese organised crime Chinese crime and Chinese intelligence working together, using the scam centres as a hub, as a front, with support from big Chinese tech companies to create an intelligence network, including Chinese police in foreign countries, being able to run Chinese, under the guise of cyber fraud operations. They were able to conduct penetration operations of Western intelligence and military operations, engaged in third-party, or I would say sweetheart deals, where key Western figures suddenly found themselves with Indian, Chinese, Cambodian, Brazilian. It wasn't just Fang Fang, folks. Fang Fang was the tip of the iceberg. Chinese organized crime, local crime entities, as well as Western criminals, have created a hotbed, particularly for grey zone intelligence gathering. Now, what is grey zone intelligence gathering? This is where governments hire third-party organizations who then hire, let's say, private citizens to engage in intelligence operations and narratives. Some world's police forces illegally ran intelligence units. This intel infrastructure was seized by Thailand. Western intelligence services treated these heavily guarded electronic fence compounds, though they were joint ventures. They're treating them publicly as a joint venture between Chinese organised crime syndicates and corrupt locals. It's in fact an intelligence gathering operation, which includes Chinese sweethearts, Cambodian Chinese sweethearts in Guam, Marshall Islands, and other islands through the Pacific to undermine Western influence, to all the way to California with movie studio, all the way into high penetration of movie studios to create anti-white male, to target core Americans, to favour foreigners over locals, to outsource huge IT contracts, which enabled then Chinese intelligence to steal Western intelligence, to steal from Western companies openly, because the Western companies openly, Facebook, Microsoft, all the companies in trouble now, they have all handed over massive research through India to Chinese intelligence through these so-called pragmatic, Google research in Shanghai was broken into, set fire to, and they did that the moment the last hard drive was emptied of all its data. Now the Indo-China Himalayan and rail standoff continues in the Pakistan corridor, where a dam was released of water to cause a bridge collapse, and since then Nepal has been a flashpoint with clashes between pro-Indian and pro-Chinese protesters funded by both sides. Pakistan has the Laka, or is it Malacca? No, the Laka resistance. Of course, China's trying to bypass the Malacca Strait and its own port. Also, China and Pakistan are trying. China is playing both sides in the Indian-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir, even though the majority of Kashmirians probably want their independence back from both sides. And this is all exploding. So this is the latest incident in a long chain of incidences. And even though a very, very handful of people are going to watch this far into the video, I thank you, because you understand and you are learning, you're wanting, you are hungry for the truth. The rest of you, particularly Ukrainian Sea Lord, can go fuck yourself. These pro-Ukrainian glibbering idiots. Now, Ukrainian Sea Lord is a former British naval officer. Apparently, I reckon he's not a navvy, not a officer. And I reckon he was. I reckon he wasn't even ranked. I reckon he got. I reckon he was a seaman for life, and probably pensioned out when he hit his 20 because he was a perpetual fuck up. Probably been in the Falklands, and was a bitter old cunt who just wants to harass me. Now, you can keep making your sock puppet accounts there, Admiral wannabe, but the truth comes out in the end that what is going on in the world today is a trilateral asymmetric warfare where you have India as the central figure in neo-colonial politics, where India is trying to take over parts of the world, China is trying to take over parts of the world, and they are squeezing Europe and America to become the third world for revenge, to justify their own actions in what's called moral equivalence. They created a narrative where the Europeans and America raped the world to justify their own rape of the world and to justify their destruction of European civilization. I don't know if this will survive YouTube, but thank you for watching. I make no apologies for the varying lengths of my videos, by the way. I'm not a professional YouTuber with a handler from Western intelligence. I mean an agent from a Californian agency. So thank you for watching. And if you do not think YouTube is an arm of Western intelligence, I've got an apartment in Israel to sell you. Recently, oh, sorry, I forgot. Asymmetric warfare. Somehow someone paid a criminal in Israel to murder Netanyahu, attempt murder, of Netanyahu. And we don't know all the details yet, but that's, or even if it's true, because there's so much fake news out there. But tomorrow the internet is going to be exploding with news about Israel. So watch that space, eh? So thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Please support the channel. You support me on Ko-Fi, Patreon, buy my books, buy my merch. Without your support, I cannot bring you more news. I cannot afford to the subscriptions to news services like Ground News. I would love to have some ground news. I would definitely love to have someone help the channel. Tomorrow I'm launching my Kickstarter, hopefully to get enough money. That'll pay for my artwork. What, you think I get all these memes for free? You think coming up with thumbnails every day is cheap? And some days some days are worse than others, and yes, I have to rely on older thumbnails. I'm doing my best here. I really am. And if you think my best isn't good enough for your support, I ask you to inflect on your own standards and see if you are basically expecting me to deliver champagne and caviar on a busman's wages. In fact, I'm earning less than minimum wage. So, bye for now.